I'm with Dr. Dana Barr, and she's from Emory University. I'd like her to give a little bit of the kind of biography that we heard from you in today's conference. Tell us a little bit about yourself, your work with CDC, and what you're doing these days.
Okay, well, I've been working with CDC since 1987. Over the years, I've worked primarily with pesticides, but other environmental chemicals as well. And when I left CDC last year, I was the chief of the pesticide laboratory, so I was in charge of all exposure assessments to pesticides at CDC. And I've worked very closely with other federal agencies and state health departments, other epidemiologists on conducting exposure studies involving pesticides and deriving what health outcomes are associated with those studies, with those exposures.
In regards to the labs there at CDC, you were in charge of, was it managing the lab?
Managing the science of the lab, but also managing the direction and the workflow that was going in the lab. It was an analytical chemistry lab. I had about $18 million worth of analytical equipment, very sophisticated equipment where we could do accurate exposure assessments. Then, I would work on the analytical end, collate the data, and interpret the data as well. And so it wasn't just managing, it was definitely managing the science behind it.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that was touched on today in this conference was the fact that children have a much more, let's just say they're predisposed to more damage from pesticides. Could you share a little bit?
Yeah, children are very vulnerable to any environmental exposures, especially pesticides. They are developing, their detoxification systems are developing, so they don't have adequate maturity to be able to detoxify their bodies. Their brains are also developing, and so they have the possibility of having some kind of interaction with those developing systems that would modulate them or adversely affect them. So they're certainly more vulnerable to health outcomes. What's equally important is they're more vulnerable toward exposures because of their behaviors. That they're on the floor, they have a lot of hand-to-mouth behavior. They typically have about twice the exposure to a certain chemical that adults or adolescents would have. And so coupling those two things, it makes it a particularly vulnerable situation for children.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Barr, we represent almost two poles as far as expertise. I'm a layman, but I live somewhere where we feel that we're getting exposed to aerial sprays. You've ran the labs for the United States government, the CDC. One of the things that we've experienced is that when we try to make positive change, we find that we're up against industry representatives that are so interested in protecting the profits of, say, the pesticide companies, that that's a very difficult thing for us as lay people. In your talk earlier in the conference, you mentioned that even at the level that you work in, you've come up head-to-head. In one case, you mentioned Dow, and I'm sure it's industry in general. Tell us about that issue.
Yeah, absolutely. Working with pesticide companies, not working necessarily with them, but working on products that are of interest to them, you put yourself open and vulnerable to attacks by them. And one incident that I was talking about was the expert panel evaluation of chlorpyrifos, where a lot of the studies that have been conducted were studies that were done in my laboratory. And Dow obviously wanted to bring in all of their hired hands to dispute that. In fact, one Dow employee called me and said, "These are the things I'm going to pick apart about your methods. It's nothing personal, but it's just my job." I know that they've tried to offer money to people in order for them to loan their name to a study so that would give more credibility. And so, yeah, my interactions with the pesticide companies in general has not been very positive. I do find occasionally there's some cooperative people, but in general they want to attack and refute the science more than they want to understand what's going on.
Mm-hmm. In regards to having worked in a government-funded agency like CDC, and having been there for, what was it, 22 years?
22 years, yes.
Did you notice a perceptible difference from one presidential administration to another because they point heads of...
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, the head of CDC is a political appointment, too. And so along with a new president comes a new head of CDC, and the priorities change. And, for example, with the current CDC director, his priority is lead-based exposures and climate change and things like that. And so the priorities of the whole center will change with the new president. We may get more funding for certain projects. We may have less funding when when the Republicans are in. We always have lots of funding for bioterrorism. When they're out, we don't. And so our funding for biomonitoring and for pesticide exposure assessment also varies along those lines as well.
Yeah. With your expertise in pesticides and having looked at the materials that we provided today that show the topography of our coastal mountain Oregon range, where you have extremely high elevations that get clear cut and aerial sprayed, with homes directly beneath, with your experience, and I might even say just with common sense, would you say that our claims may be valid?
I think they're highly plausible. I think that it warrants a study for sure. I mean, I think that we understand from some of the other studies that we've done that topology is a very important factor. And in fact, I've previously completed one in Thailand that showed in the same district, they just had different topologies, and so their pesticide exposures were very different. And so I think given that information and the proximity to your homes, that it certainly warrants some kind of study to evaluate the drift and evaluate whether the exposures are, that you are being exposed to these chemicals. Yes, I do.
Okay. Here's a question that might sound funny, but to me, it seems like we, the American people, are now told that commonly, if they do an analysis of an American's bloodstream, they find a whole litany. Well, one of the chemicals from plastic has been popularized as being in our bloodstream, and various pesticides and chemicals are in our bloodstream, and yet none of us ever got to participate in any form of democratic discussion or debate to give an informed consent that we felt that the beneficial use of product A warranted having components of it in our personal bloodstream. Do you think that there's the potential for a new human rights movement based on the right to give consent before companies can put chemicals into our bloodstream?
That's actually an interesting thing you propose. I don't know if we're at a point where we could do something like that, but we're certainly at a point where we know we need reform of government policies. Right now the policies are such that they can remove a chemical because they may suspect it has adverse health outcomes with it, but they replace that chemical with one with no toxicity data whatsoever. And so it just seems kind of counterintuitive that they would be doing that. So, I think that what you say is very valid, and at least if nothing else, it does suggest we need some kind of policy reform in our government system.
In regards to the discussion on policy reform, FIFRA, the laws that have to do with fungicides, pesticides, insecticides, and their regulations by the United States government, was there a lot of lobbyist involvement in the creation of FIFRA, and are there recommendations you would make that you think would take a step towards sane policy decisions?
I don't know how much lobbyist involvement there was with FIFRA. I know that with the FQPA that there is a lot of lobbying that goes on with the pesticide industry.
And say what FQPA is.
Food Quality and Protection Act.
Okay.
And a lot of studies are conducted jointly between industry and EPA, which kind of muddies the waters of separation between them. And so I think that they need to have something in place that involves purely independent studies when they're making these kinds of considerations about policy decisions. And right now, I think that the industry does have a large influential factor in that area.
Folks like us living in a coastal mountain range, which is heavily aerial sprayed with pesticides, here in Oregon, there is no buffer zone in place for aerial sprays, so they could actually helicopter spray pesticide right near a child's bedroom window, and in fact, that has happened, and we know it's happened. How do you feel? I mean, you're a scientist, and you are going to be very study-oriented, and there hasn't been a lot of studies in this area. We'd like to see them. How do you intuitionally feel about, would it make sense to you that there should be some form of buffer around a home or a school before they can aerial spray pesticides?
Well, I've told you before, my opinion is that, even if we can't show that a health outcome is related with a certain exposure, we at least deserve to be in a unpolluted environment. And certainly your own property and your own home should remain unpolluted unless you do so yourself. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, I definitely think there should be something in place that is protective of children, but not only children, but it's protective of all humans as well.
Us big children.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. We want to thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's my pleasure to be here.
Dr. Dana Barr.